Tonight, we dive into the darkest pages of fiction, where nightmares are inked into existence. Welcome to Fright Nights, where authors reveal the stories that will haunt you long after the last page is turned.
All right, and yes, welcome back into Fright Nights. This is our second episode. Very excited to be doing this tonight because tonight is the first episode where we're having an author. Last month we had the director, Josh. Today we have the author, Josh. Not Josh, but Josh. So Josh Haney, I appreciate you taking some time to sit down with me here tonight on another episode of Fright Nights.
Thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.
Now, like me, you're a huge horror super fan. So before we get into like you being an author and some of your books, I'm curious as to what drew you into the horror genre to begin with.
There's a lot of, I've gone back and forth about this trying to figure out what it was, and I think it was just growing up where I grew up. I grew up in Baltimore, down the road from Edgar Allan Poe's grave. I grew up in a house that I know for a fact was haunted. I had a lot of experiences around those kinds of things. My parents took me to see Alice Cooper when I was a kid. Music was always a very big part of my life. Punk rock was a big part of my life, the Misfits. And, everything just kind of coalesced all into this ball of things. My go-to reading as a child was H.P. Lovecraft, Edgar Allan Poe, Ray Bradbury. So add into that, heaping helpings of 70s and early 80s British folk horror television shows like The Owl Service and Children of the Stones, which used to play in the city. They played it on, what was the name of that? I think it was called Third Eye or something like that, but they would have pieces of that in there. And then, Channel 54 in Baltimore and Channel 45 in Baltimore on Saturday nights had Monster Movie Night. So it all just kind of coalesced and came together and just created the rabid horror nerd you see in front of you.
And I always ask that question because I feel like you can ask hundreds of horror fans what got them into it, and you'll get majority of them a different answer from each one. And like for me, I was raised in a very religious family, so we were not allowed to watch horror movies because they were considered demonic and satanic.
Okay.
And then when I went to college on my own, I started branching out and watching them, and then I was hooked like that. I think for me, it might have been because it was so forbidden growing up, and then once I had the freedom to do it, I was hooked. But I've been hooked ever since. Try to go out in the theaters as often as I can and see what see.
And see, I grew up in what I like to call the golden age of splatter.
Okay.
And there were friends of mine and I used to have discussions about this all the time. And there was that time when everything started coming out on video, and you could literally go to the video store and just a wall as far as the eye could see. And a lot of us would go there, and you would start in the horror section at A, and you would grab a couple of movies, you'd take them home and watch them, you'd bring them back, you'd go to the next set, and you'd literally try to make A to Z. And then, of course, within that, by the time you got through everything, there were 10,000 new movies up on the shelves. And this was at a time, throughout the 80s when they were putting out anything you could think of. I mean, yeah, they were putting out, The Exorcist and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween and, whatever mainstreamy kind of things that you could think of. But at the same time, you could go and you could rent Necromantic or Necromantic 2 or 120 Days of Sodom or, The Wicker Man. And a lot of Argento stuff like Suspiria, where as a kid you're watching this and you're you find The Wicker Man, which is easily one of my favorite movies ever. I mean, I've got several Wicker Man tattoos. There was a time not that long ago, and I still toy with the idea that I wanted to start a Wicker Man cover band. And literally just show the movie and have the band perform the songs over top of it. But to find that in the horror section, you were like, oh, okay, this. I mean, Christopher Lee, this is going to be insane. And then you watch it, and it blows your mind because you're like, what the hell is this? And a lot of that kind of, I think growing up at that time period really opened a lot of doors because you weren't pigeonholed into, horror is A Nightmare on Elm Street or horror is Friday the 13th. There was a vast array of things, and of course a lot of the stuff from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s was all coming out on video for the first time. So you would find things like Psychomania.
Yeah.
They I mean, pagan motorcycle in England with standing stones and freaky ritual worship to resurrect the dead. Like, where else are you going to see stuff like that?
Yeah, especially like nowadays with things being able to stream almost anywhere, like Tubi's and Shudder are big with
Yeah,
being able to stream horror. And like I've talked to you a little bit in the weeks prior to this episode, is that I've been doing that challenge of, I know it's outrageous and it's probably never going to get completed, but I want to see every color horror film ever made, and these being able to stream it on these services has made
yeah,
seeing stuff from the 60s and the 50s that I never would have even imagined I'd be able to watch
yeah.
that much
And
easier to get a hold of.
that's the thing. I mean, there's a lot of like Shutter. I applaud Shutter. I really like the way that they've curated things. I do. I love a lot of the stuff that they're doing, and then a lot of the companies. I mean, there's people that are really stepping up and working to save a lot of these films and curate these films. The all haunts be ours that Kira, what's her last name? Lajeunesse, I want to say it is. I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation there, but the two volumes of that are like the folk horror box sets that Severin did. That each one of those has like 40 movies in it, and there's stuff in there that I I had never seen.
Yeah.
Uh, that films like Demon, that I saw that and I was like, how did I miss this? Uh, so it's always a noble aspiration to try. All of us have done the challenge. I'm going to see every single dot 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 horror movie all the way down the line. I used to break it down by decade because I figured if I could get through anything I could find from the 30s, there if it hasn't come out already, it's probably a lost film and you're never going to see it.
Yeah.
Same with the 40s, the 50s. I mean, maybe you could still stumble upon some things. The 60s as well. I mean, they're still, coming back and unearthing some of Ed Wood's pornographic films right now. They just did that. What was the box set? Hardwood. That is a bunch of his X-rated movies, and I mean the whole thing is brilliant. I mean, it's Ed Wood, so there's witchcraft and nudity, and but because it was Ed Wood, the brilliance behind that was that he shot a hardcore pornographic film and then edited out the hardcore scenes and released it also as a softcore film, so that you're making money on both sides of the spectrum. Yeah. So it's just stuff like that where you're like, bravo, like I've never seen this.
And now, like I said, we've been talking about the movies, but you're on here because you are a horror author. Now, I'm curious, when you decided to go into that, what made you want to go into the writing the horror or novels or short stories as opposed to like doing something in the movies or something like that?
So originally, I've always been a writer. I've been a writer since I was a kid. As a kid, with a friend of mine, we had, if you remember the old Ditto machines that you would crank and it would spit everything out with purple ink on you know, on white paper, we did a short story magazine that I had called Guillotine Horror Magazine. And that was probably right around like 84 or 85. And they were terrible stories. I mean, I think I was probably in what, maybe fifth grade, sixth grade at the time. And, but it was spooky stories, and it was something that I enjoyed. I always kept writing, and originally I was trying to make films. I figured that was the way to go, and I started a production company called Evil Cheerleader Productions, and I was going to make the what I wanted to make. I wanted to make C movies. I didn't want A class movies, and I didn't want to make B movies. I wanted to make gory, raunchy, satanic craziness. I at the time I was watching a lot of Jörg Buttgereit stuff like Necromantic and Der Todesking. I was watching a lot of Olaf Ittenbach, like Promudos, and I was watching all kinds of like crazy Mondo documentaries and stuff. And I was like, oh, I could do this, I could do this, and I rapidly realized that I couldn't do it because I had to rely on cast, I had to rely on crew, and I ended up taking some of the ideas that I had originally written down to kind of turn into scripts, and I started turning them into short stories. I've never really been one. I love reading novels. Don't get me wrong, but the people that I enjoyed reading growing up, Poe, Lovecraft, M.R. James, Algernon Blackwood, the people that I tend to read a lot, even Thomas Ligotti, who's somebody that I adore and still read, probably weekly. These were people that predominantly stayed within short stories. And I started thinking about it, and originally my first thing I was gonna write a novel. I was gonna write a novel, and it just never came to pass. I started writing short stories, and that's pretty much what I've stuck to. Yes, there are some longer pieces in there, but for the most part, short stories are where I like to be. Uh, I've got a bunch of books out now. They're all short story collections. Some of them are themed, some of them tie together in places. But yeah, I mean, short stories are that's my go-to. I like seeing what I can do within that confined space, if that makes sense.
And it does, and that was one of the things that was going to bring me into the next topic. Is you get authors like Stephen King that can put out a phenomenal novel, but I feel like horror is one of the hardest genres to put on paper and make it transmit the way you want it to. Like action, romance, comedies, all of those work great in book form. But horror, I feel like it's harder to get the fear and that emotion across, which is what I feel like short stories are better. Like Poe and like the ones I've read of yours, having it set to like a shorter time frame actually builds the suspense a little better than if I were to sit and try to read a 300 page novel.
Well, I agree. There's there's something about that that short sharpness where you look at a book, whatever the book happens to be, especially like collections of short stories, and you'll pick up that book and you'll say, okay, this story is 10 pages. And maybe you're sitting down at night, you're getting ready for bed, you're like, I'm going to pick up this book and I'm going to read this story. It's 10 pages. So already in your mind, you're thinking, okay, it's this big. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's 10 pages. It's not picking up, The Stand at whatever 1,300 and some pages and being like, okay, chapter one. It's going into it that you're going to read 10 pages, and hopefully within that 10 pages or 15 pages or even less, maybe more, but somewhere in there, that that's what's going to grab you, and that's what's going to capture you. And I like I said, I like the challenge of trying to keep within those bounds and seeing how far I can push somebody within that space.
And that was my thing. Like when I read the horror short stories and stuff like that, I since I know that it's limited to how like you said, 10 pages, while I'm reading it, I know there's gonna be that twist or that scare, but then it's just in my head. I'm like, all right, well, when is it gonna come? And I think that builds the
Exactly.
suspense even more
Right.
having such
And
a smaller book.
right, because you can feel the rope tightening around your neck. You can feel the creak of the drop coming, but you don't know exactly when it's going to happen. And then when it gets there, if it's done right, when it gets there, it blows you away, and it takes you. I like so my first book was when people would talk to me about the horror of it all, which was my first book. I like to tell them that it was basically campfire tales. It was short stories, campfire tales, and it was the way I always described it was a candy bar with a razor blade hidden in the middle.
Okay.
Um, and that's what I've always tried to keep to is I want it to draw somebody in, but I want it to be something that that when the world turns upside down on them within that realm, that it sticks with them, it stays with them, it makes them think.
And so looking now at like in the mind of a horror author, what kind of process do you go through when you're trying to come up with your short stories, or when you're doing a collection of trying to pick which stories go well together in this collection, and or anything like that?
So when I write, and I've joked about this before, I usually write from experience. So for example, psychogeography, which was my last book to be released, uh, I wrote the entirety of psychogeography while I was doing tours on the ambulance. So I'm a National Registry EMT, and I was on the ambulance with my partners, and I would travel around, and you're on the ambulance for 12, 13, 14, 15 hours at a time, and you're seeing all of these things. And as I would see these bits and pieces, I'm out here on the east end of Long Island, and you would you would see these. Long Island's kind of a weird place because you have graveyards from with graves from the 15, 16, 1700s. You have houses that are that old. You have a lot of history here, but at the same time you have New York City is a stone's throw away, and the urban sprawl that comes with that creates this weird kind of dichotomy where you've got 1 foot in history and 1 foot in modernity. And so like that's where my thought process with stories tends to come from is I will I tend to draw from real life. So I will place my stories in places that I go, places that I hang out, things that I see, places I've stumbled across, situations that take place to me. And I always joke with friends of mine that you got to be careful when you're friends with a horror writer, because chances are you're going to end up in one of the stories,
And
and that's just how it happens.
and I'm slowly noticing because the books of yours that so far that I've read are ones that Big Nate has lent to me, and I'm realizing as we're talking that he did that out of order because I have read Psychogeography and The Locket, which are the first two, and then I am yet to read The Horror of It All, which was the first. So he gave them to me all out of order. But if you want to, we can talk a little bit about the psychogeography because that was the
Yeah.
first one I read, and that was a little bit of a collection, and it seemed like there's a little story for everybody, and it kind of reminded me, like movie wise, relating it to like a short movie anthology kind of stuff like that, where there's like each story is a different type of horror. That way, if somebody didn't like the first one, they might like the second one. If they don't like the second, there's something in there for everybody.
Well, yeah, psychogeography was psychogeography. I did a lot of studying, and I'm still doing a lot of studying about, the actual science of psychogeography. The fact that basically, like this, what they call the stone tape theory, that weird things that take place in these places can leave an indelible mark on them. And as such, so for example, the cover of psychogeography was a picture I took when the ambulance that I was riding, we were stationed over by Kings Park. Kings Park is a notorious psychiatric facility in New York that was shut down a very long time ago. And now it stands there as this behemoth covered in graffiti and tales that everybody tells everybody else. Well, my brother's sister's cousin's former roommate was in there and saw this or saw that. And there's, when you first open the book, the first page I put in there, it says there's something wrong with the land. And that's kind of what I was talking about before, was this weird aspect within, New York as a whole, but really a lot of Long Island. The first story that really came out of psychogeography was The Witch in the Wood, which came from, traveling out to East Hampton, New York, and hearing the stories of the only witch that was ever tried on Long Island. Everybody knows about the Salem witch hunts, but to hear that there was actually a witch tried in New York is something that most people don't know about.
Yeah, and it's like
And so like being in those kinds of spaces, it always appeals to me.
yeah, I like how you mentioned like the beginning about it, these places having that history of all this stuff happening, and it's kind of like my my first guest that I had on was talking about one of his movies was The Devil's Vortex, and they filmed it in this place in California that apparently is home to one of these supernatural vortexes that
Hmm.
causes all this stuff to happen. I think it's kind of cool that like a lot of people when they hear about horror and ghost stories and stuff like that, they're like, "There's no way it's real." But then there's actually recorded stuff of these locations being known for all of this to happen. And I mean, like it really, like if you're not a believer, it kind of opens your eyes that there is something going on.
Right. Well, I mean, horror and science have been together forever. I mean, that's just part of it. That's part and parcel, you know, because everybody wants to believe, but at the same time, everybody is looking for some sort of scientific, gold star on the forehead saying that yes, this is real. You know what I mean? And I mean, you can go back in and read all kinds of books. I mean, look at Frankenstein. There, right there, you have horror and science fiction all kind of melding together, and there's definitely something to it.
And we talked about how like where you kind of get your inspirations from and stuff like that. But when it comes to writing your stories, like I said, there's in especially in psychogeography, there's different stories for like different types of subgenres, like the psychologicals, the thrillers, the slasher type gore. Is there one over the other that you prefer to write
No,
in like
so
a
I
specific?
no, I mean, I like to tell everybody I write to get the demon to shut up in my head. Um, which, is it's that's how I always look at it is I will get I'll get an idea for a story. And generally speaking, I'll either get I'll either get the opening for a story, but I have no idea where it's going, or I'll get the ending for a story, but I have no idea how to get there.
Yeah.
So I literally have pages and pages and pages of story ideas that are either an opening or an ending. And when I get those ideas, I will sit down and I just try to figure out, okay, well, where am I going with this? If this is the ending, and I already know where the end point is, and I've already closed my eyes and I've already seen these characters, then all I have to do is figure out how to get them to that end. And on the same side of that, if I have the beginning, then I'm learning these things as the characters are learning these things. Trinity out of psychogeography was a lot like that, where I knew where I wanted the character to go, but I wasn't quite sure how to get him there.
Okay.
And that one was kind of, a lot of time was spent just walking around downtown and going to places that I would, I normally would just go to, my friend's brewery or a restaurant that I like or something like that, and just kind of wandering around and just taking in the situation, and then ideas would spring up.
So along that line of sometimes not knowing how to get the character where they are or how they got there in the first place, has there ever been a moment when you were writing where you finished it and then you were just impressed with your own work and just still couldn't realize how you did that or how you managed to come up with that or anything like along that line?
That yeah, the locket. Um, the locket is I still say that I think the locket is probably the best thing I ever wrote. Um, and I don't know that I'll ever compete with that. I really don't. Um, but I mean, the locket was interesting because I started writing it when I was in high school. So now you're talking, I mean, I graduated high school in what, 92, 93. So, I mean, I started writing it then, and I wrote a little bit of it, and then I was like, I don't know where to go with this, and I'd put it away. And then a few years would go by, and I'd take it out, and I'd be like, oh, and I didn't know what to do, so I'd put it away again. And then back in, I want to say, I think it was 2011, it it all just kind of came to a head. And I mean, if you read the locket and you read the afterword in the locket, it kind of explains like what was going on in the background while that was being written. And but I to this day I I don't know where it came from. I mean, I wrote the locket, I think start to finish was probably about 7 days, I think it was. And most of that's a blur. I don't remember I don't remember exactly how I got there. I just, and every so often I will, I've done performances of the Locket quite a few times, and every time I read it start to finish, I'm just like, wow. Um, that one blows me away. Another one is Valmerky, which is a story that virtually no one has heard. I did it as a small. I think I've got a copy over here somewhere. Yeah. So this, I don't know if you can see it or not, but this is an ashcan edition of Valmerky, which uh, only was printed 31 copies. That's it.
Okay.
And it was performed one time at a Halloween show that I do every year to at my friend's brewery, and I wrote that story and only printed up 31 copies of it. And so virtually no one has heard that story, but it's another one of those stories where I the night that I read it, I was like, wow, this is actually pretty good. I mean, and I tend to be my own harshest critic. I really am.
And that was
I
one of my things with you bringing up the Locket. That's where I was going to navigate it next, because that, out of the ones I've read so far, that was the one that did stand out to me. As I'm the entire time, even though it is a short story, I'm sitting here trying to figure out where the twist is going to come in, like what's going to happen. And then when it actually did, I'm like, well, fuck, that's not what I thought was going to happen. Like it was just
Yeah.
went a completely different direction than I was had any intention of it going in throughout the reading process.
Yeah, the locket has it has a dark magic to it. When people would ask me about it, they'd say, "Oh, you're a horror writer." I'd say, "Yeah," and they'd say, "Okay, well, what about this one?" And I'd go, "Oh, that's a tragic love story."
And that was one of the things like that. I feel like it was perfect that you left that one as a standalone story, like it's its own small book rather than being in a collection. Because I feel like if it was in a collection, having something before or after it kind of would have taken away from that effect that the readers got from going through that process. And just having it as its own book and being able to just put it down when that was done, I feel like helped enhance the effect that you were trying to put over in that.
Well, I mean, I so when the locket originally came out, my good friend Mark Dickinson, who's also a writer, a great musician, and he has helped me, you know, with all kinds of writing, recording, all kinds of stuff. Back in the day, years and years and years ago, I mean, hell, it's probably been 25 years now. Uh, a lot of us used to hang out on the internet on a like a almost like a bulletin board system thing called the World Horror Network. And then the World Horror Network ended up morphing into horrorpunks.com, but they were releasing collections of short stories. And The Locket originally appeared as a short story in one of those collections. And if you read the afterword, you'll see that there was, a slight change to the dedication, but other than that, the story was the story. And when I was going after the horror of it all came out, you know, I hadn't written anything in a while, and I wanted the locket to be its own thing. I didn't want it to be in this book with 10 other stories. I thought that the locket deserved to be an experience that a reader could sit down and I just wanted it. I wanted it to hit them. I wanted it to just get inside them and not let go for a little while.
And now for like we had started this somehow sometimes like even like I had thought that horror is one of the harder genres to get across in a book short story format. For those people that are listening now or watching that whether they're a horror film fan or not, and they just don't want to get into reading horror because of that fact. Like, what would you be able to say to them to try and kind of nudge them in that direction to try and get them to at least try out reading horror rather than just watching it?
So, unfortunately, nobody really wants to read anymore. Everybody wants to stream, everybody wants to listen. And believe me, I watch movies constantly. I listen to audiobooks all the time, and it's great. But there is something to be said about sitting by yourself in a you know whatever area you like to be, and picking up this piece of dead tree with these cryptic symbols on it that creates a psychedelic movie inside your brain. And I don't think that enough people appreciate the magic behind the written word, where all of these symbols put together will create images inside of your head, free of drugs, free of alcohol, free of anything. You can literally be transported anywhere within this magical piece of rotting wood, which there's something to be said about that. And I mean, Kindle's fine and all, but there's nothing quite like, reaching over your shoulder and picking up the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe, which I believe this edition, I don't remember off the top of my head because it was a gift, but I think this one was early 1900s. But I mean, like, there's just something to be said. Yeah, 1927, but there's something to be said about that that television and audio books and Kindle just can't compare with.
I agree along the same lines. As I much prefer having the physical copy in my hands, but like for me, I do have a Kindle because, like I said, apartment life and moving every couple of
Dude,
years.
I believe me,
But yeah,
I am guilty of it. I am guilty of it. I rail against it, but I'm guilty of it. I have Kindle on my phone so that I can read whenever I want to. I listen to audiobooks from Audible all the time. So again, I'm just as guilty. I mean, there's some great companies out there doing audiobook stuff like Bafflegab. Those guys are awesome. They're awesome. They did Blood on Satan's Claw. They did The Hellbound Heart, and I mean Cadabra Records. The stuff that Jonathan Dennison and Cadabra Records is doing will blow people away. Amazing, amazing audio books. Just outstanding stuff. But again, like, I'll sit there, I'll listen to an audiobook, I will read something on Kindle, but you know if I want to have a nice day, I'll grab a beer, I'll go out in the woods, I'll sit down with a book and I'll read.
yeah. And so we've talked about a couple of the books that you've released already, but I do want to ask, what do we have coming in the future from you? Whether it's another collection, individual stories, or what's on the horizon for Josh?
So I mean, there's so psychogeography was originally supposed to be, I'm trying to think of how to even describe it. So the idea behind psychogeography and the idea that there was something wrong with the land was an idea that I've been trying to move towards for some time, where I want to kind of create a collection of esoteric stories that are not really tied together individually, but open the reader's mind to ideas outside of what they would consider the norm. And so I've been working on another collection of stories right now that are, again, I look at psychogeography as more of like a folk horror book where there's a lot of weird occurrences and strange things that take place within those stories. Um, but again, the same could be said of my book, What the Murder Saw. But I've been working on more of that kind of vein of stories. Uh, Nate, I still owe him Night Howls, which is a story that was half of it was released, but the other half of it was never released back when Nate had his website going. And each chapter, he challenged me at one point in time to write a serialized horror story of my choosing. And I wrote a story about a bounty hunter in the late 1800s that was solving problems. Think Kolchak the Night Stalker crossed with the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And, so I still want to release that eventually. There's a lot of things that I want to do. I would love to release another album, so that's all happening. But I've got some ideas right now for a few stories that I think are going to fit more into that vein of things. I'm also talking to a few people right now. I'd like to release The Locket as an audiobook. I'd love to release Valmerky as an audiobook as well, because I think both of those are things that people would like to listen to. And I listen to a lot of music, especially when I write. If you look in the books, you've seen it. There's literally like lists of what I was listening to while I was
Yeah.
writing this. And so I've been in a bunch of bands, and I think that The Locket would be a very good audiobook that could be released with music attached to it, and I think that it would actually be like a really good package, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that definitely one that would fit that kind of format. And for those that are curious that are watching now, what you've released and what's going to come out in the future, where can they find the books if they're interested in getting them for themselves and
Yeah,
giving them a try?
yeah, all my stuff's up on Amazon. Amazon is, it's easier nowadays to get those kinds of things released, especially if you're doing it as an independent publisher. All of my stuff comes out under the imprint Ulfenhofen or Wolf and Raven, and Wolf and Raven Publishing. And it also still comes out with my original company moniker. It's all of the books say an Evil Cheerleader production. And so it's all up on Amazon. The Locket's on Amazon. Sentence Fragments from a Broken Mind is on there. What the Murder Saw is on there. Psychogeography's on there. Um, the only one that's not on there is The Horror of It All. The Horror of It All was released by a different publisher that has long been out of business. And I think I'm the only person that still has copies of The Horror of It All. It was originally printed in, I think the print run for that one was 500 copies. And then I want to say roughly 100 of those copies, along with the original artwork, were stolen from the U.S. mail. So, I
Wow.
mean, that book itself, I think I've only got maybe 25 or 30 copies of it myself. So not too many.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna, after I finish reading the horror of it all, gonna check out some of the other ones on Amazon. But I am glad you mentioned the one that Big Nate's been pestering you about, because about 20 minutes before he left, he told me to make sure I asked you about it, and I completely forgot. So I'm glad that was brought up.
Yeah,
He'll be
look, Night House is a great story. It was a fun story. Um, and it at the time I was writing it, I was living in a small little town in Wyoming, right on the Wyoming Colorado border, and there was a lot of like old West history there. And I tied a lot of night howls in with Wild West history, as well as, you know, weird tales. Um, you know, and it was so much fun to write. It really was. And it seems like a real disservice to not just put it out there. Um, it was definitely a fun one. I don't know if it's going to read as well now as it did then, because then it was coming out, like I said, it was written as a serial. So every month I would send him, that month's chapter, and then a list of the songs that I was listening to at the time. And there were songs on there from Ghoultown and, Psycho Charger and the Deep End, the Ghastly Ones, the Hammer Downs, like all of these, like, the Coffin Shakers, the Necromantics, you know. So it had this, like, this Wild West, but kind of like rockabilly meets near dark kind of feel to it. And it was just a lot of fun to release. So I think eventually it needs to get out there, just because I think a lot of people would enjoy it. Um, but again, like, I'm not in it for the money. I'm in it because I just want to scare the hell out of people.
yeah, and I mean, I feel like that's one of the things more so about being an author as opposed to a director or an actor, because in the film industry, a lot of it is money based. But to be able to sit down and write an actual story, you got to have some commitment to it, and you got to put your heart into it. And I feel like that's one of the fun things about talking to authors and reading those stories, is that it took them a lot of time, and they put a lot of effort and time and work into that.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's there's a lot of blood that goes into these tales. There's the old quote from Clive Barker with the Books of Blood, and everybody's heard that quote, but it's true. You open yourself up to these kinds of things. And, the horror genre itself is kind of strange that way, because I think that, to go backwards to what we were talking about earlier, the horror genre tends to really open people up to odd occurrences and strange things happening. And, especially being a writer within that genre, you tend to open yourself up to a lot of really weird things happening. And that takes you some interesting places sometimes.
And that's one of the other things I like about horror, whether it's films or books, is a lot of times with the time changing and like all this kind of stuff, different things happening, new inventions, stuff like that. Horror has adapted to that, and they've released a lot of movies that are just about stuff you never would have expected. Like I was talking to Big Nate about a week ago about the horror series called Evil Bong, and then you've got
Mm-hmm.
like the Ginger Dead Man, and then
Yep.
I think they made one about uh Tesla's going crazy and going off the rails, and like horror is one of those genres where you can really do a movie about anything and make it
Yeah.
scary.
But again, you can do a book about about anything. You can do a story about anything. You just gotta, it's gotta be something that taps in and gets inside of somebody's head. As long as I can tap on the door and get you to open that door or crack, I can get inside.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And I think that's the scariest part about it, is that all you have to do is open yourself up that much. As long as you open yourself up that much, you know, whatever the story is, it can get in there. I mean, you know, look at the old tale about uh guinea pig, the devil's experiment, that that an unnamed actor from the 80s who was on a big comedy show was at a party and saw that film and thought that it was an actual snuff film and contacted the FBI. Like, now I'll admit, like, if you just pop that videotape in and started watching it, yeah, you might question what you had just gotten yourself into. You know, but now you have, you know, films like a Serbian movie, which was just a gut-wrenching horror film. Like, it's, you you want to turn away from it, but you got to watch it all the way to the end.
Yeah.
You know, or some of the, like, the French new extreme movies that were coming out, things like Irreversible and you know, Martyrs, like, just crazy stuff that you have no idea where it's going. Or even like this new wave of folk horror films that are coming out now. You know, a lot of those, um like In the Earth and Hereditary and Midsummer. And I mean, some of those movies, just, they get inside your head. Like I said, as long as they can get in that much, then they can get in there and just fuck some shit up and leave a lasting impression on you.
Yep. And but like I said, with it being so versatile, is like and being able to do it with anything. We talked about this a little bit before I started recording. Is they've even started taking children's movies like Disney and turning those into
Yep.
horror films and making its own little universe for that. And that's
But I mean, but
th-
again, like that, even that goes back. You know, I mean, Peter Jackson did it with Meet the Feebles.
yeah.
Um, you know, some of those, like, I mean, the brothers Quay were doing stop motion movies that would just, I mean, they would scare the shit out of you. You know, and I mean, you watch some of those things now, and you're just like, yeah, that's still pretty scary. That's, you know, I just watched the new Nosferatu not that long ago, and ended up watching, you know, several versions of Nosferatu, like, basically one after another after another.
Yeah.
I watched that one. I watched the Herzog one, and I watched the Murnau, and even, you know, each one of those is removed from the other one by decades, but they're all horrifying in their own right, and they all tap into that same kind of thing, you know?
And that's another thing is like these remakes like the Nosferatu and some of these other films that pull from movies that were way back when there was no talking, it was silent films,
Yep.
to still be able to put forth that same sense of fear and like suspense with it being able to people talking and everything like that they were able to do back then with
And
silent
Dread.
films. It's
Dread.
impressive to be able to keep that sense of fear all these years later
Oh
as
yeah. I mean, the one that always speaks to me, that's, you know, one of one of my favorites was Haxan, the Benjamin Christensen movie that was like based on the Malleus Maleficarum, and it was, like all these witchcraft rituals and stuff like that. Like I still watch that movie, and it's a silent film. I mean, granted, you could watch the one from, I think it was the 60s, with William S. Burroughs doing the voiceover on it, which is pretty crazy in and of itself. But I mean, it's like, you watch that and it's just, there's this like pervading sense of dread, this pervasive sense of dread there. And some of those silent movies, even into like the Universal movies that were coming out, but again, there were a lot of movies that were coming out of Europe throughout the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s that just tapped into those kinds of things. And just were just, still, like, I still think of some of those movies constantly. Things like Mark of the Devil. You watch Mark of the Devil, and I mean, that tongue scene will just get you, man. You know what I'm saying?
And that's been one of the things for me that, like, because I think everybody's got something that when they watch horror movies, there's a certain thing that'll happen that's the thing that that unsettles you, gives you the ick, I would say. Mine has always been the abnormal body contortion. Like when somebody, like if they get hit and like they break a leg, it's in the wrong weird angle, and then you can just hear it cracking and see it
Hmm.
popping back in place. That's my one thing that
Now
kind of
is it
throws me off. And
now is it the broken bone, or is it like the body horror, like the
I would
Cronenberg style body horror, or Tetsuo the Iron Man body horror kind of thing?
so the best example for me that I can throw out is the movie Malignant,
Okay.
when the brother would take over and dislocate the arms or whatever and make her go the run the backwards,
Yep.
but it's
Okay.
the
Fair enough.
it's not as much her running, it's just the contortioning part that happens to get to that point.
Yep.
It's just in my head I'm like, you shouldn't move that way. And then that's what makes me uneasy in these films. That's like my one big thing. And I was curious if you had that one specific moment, like anytime a film it happens, you kind of wince a little bit.
One of the one, like, and again, I said before, I'm an EMT, and like, eyeballs really fuck me up. I'll be the first to admit that. I blame Fulci for that. I really do. But like, I really think like the one that really gets me more than anything is Argento and his goddamn straight razors. Like, just, there's something to be said about that. I watched a lot of Argento. I love Argento. Suspiria was one of my favorite things when I was young, and it still is. But like, Argento knew how to shoot like these straight razor sequences with the black leather glove and the razor, and like just like swiping at people, or people reaching out for it, and just like that really, yeah, that one just kind of, you know kind of gets the pucker factor up a little bit.
And now, before we get too much further into our fun segment with the horror in general questions, I remember you mentioned that growing up you lived in a haunted house and that you had some experiences from that. And I'm always curious when I meet people that say they've had experiences, like what, like kind of, if you're willing to tell us a little bit about some of them or
Yeah.
how they went.
So I've seen a lot of I've seen too many things. The way that I always describe it is, I've seen too many things to not believe that there is something right outside of where we're at. And the house that that I was in as a kid, um, there there was there was something there. There was something in there. I saw things in there that I couldn't explain. Um, and then of course, I would try to explain it. It would, oh no, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. That didn't happen. One of the experiences I actually ended up using for a piece of the story in What the Murder Saw. Um, and then again, I mean, see, What the Murder Saw was kind of interesting because there's a lot of stuff hidden in that story that nobody really knows about other than me. And there's a lot of, paranormal activity that's hidden within those tales that that is stuff that I personally experienced, and I needed to include it in there because it was too good. Um, after I had a good friend of mine that died several years back, that we were really close, and I've had many things happen right here with me after his death that I can only attribute to him. And um and I included that in that story. And I've got picture evidence and video evidence from that I've shown people, and they're like, I can't explain it. um so Derek, if you're down here, buddy, sláinte.
And like I've had similar experience. Like when my dad passed away, there'd be little things in the house, like just be me sitting in the living room. The TV would turn on to his favorite show and stuff like that. But recently, for me, one of the big things that really like actually freaked me out was I was babysitting for a friend of mine, and while she was at work, like 4:30 in the morning, waiting for her to come home, I'm on her bed watching YouTube on her TV, my back to the door. I just randomly roll over and I see a woman with long black hair kind of peeking around the corner. I'm like, it's 4:30 in the morning. I'm exhausted. That's all it is. Rolled back over, kept watching YouTube. When my friend got home, she came in, asked me why I was still awake. I'm like, I was just sitting here watching some videos, stuff like that. And she's like, was she here? I said, who? She's like, the woman that likes to peek around the door and watch you on the bed. I'm like, well, now it's fucking real. That was one of those big moments where I'm like, well, because it's like I didn't bring it up to her. I didn't hint that I'd seen anything, but that was
It
the first
happens.
thought in her mind was she here? My thought process
And
was, why are you still here? That's
shortly after my friend died, um, I was down here, and like I said, this is my office. This is where I do a lot of my writing, and I had written the introduction for his first book, which came out shortly before he died. And I wrote this introduction. In the introduction, I made this joke about him and I, that we would always joke about, and that if whoever the first one was to die, the other one had to do a ritual to raise them back from the dead. And it was like an ongoing joke between us. And I came downstairs, and while I was down here, I heard, and I was like, "What the hell is that?" And I mean, as you can see, there's books everywhere.
yeah.
And I looked on the floor, and there were two books laying on the floor. And I was like, how the hell did those two books end up on the floor? That doesn't make sense. And I looked down, and the one that was on top was his book that I had written the introduction for. And when I moved his book out of the way, the book that was underneath of it was an old, um, like an old Jack Chick tract, Christian propaganda book.
Uh-huh.
And it was a line drawing of the Grim Reaper with a bubble that said, "I'll be seeing you soon."
Like I said, that's why doing Fright Nights, it's always like the people that say that they've had these experiences. I always enjoy asking them like if they would like to talk about them, and just because it's crazy to think that there's so many people out there that think that ghosts and spirits and the supernatural doesn't exist, and then they hear people like us tell the stories that have happened to us, and maybe they start to question the bumps in the night in the future and stuff like that.
Look, if I don't know if ask Nate when you see him if he has a copy of the CD. I released a CD called "A Horror Unleashed from Stygian Depths." That was
Okay.
so basically the CD came out labeled as Gruesome Twosome, and it was my band at the time that I still record under that moniker, but it was Josh Haney and the Nightmare Factory. But I had done a live on Halloween conjuration to the Lovecraftian entity Yog Sothoth for his radio show. And the cover of that segment was actually this weird light anomaly that I took a picture of from my front porch the night that I was mixing all of that live for him to do as a Halloween performance. I don't know if he's got a copy of it or not, but that album's been out of print for like I think 10 years now or something.
Oh, I'm
I think
sure he's
I'm
got it somewhere. We'll track
I
it
think
down.
I'm the only person I think that has a copy of it, but
I'm sure he's still got it somewhere. We'll make sure to track it down and I'll give it a listen. But yeah, now I feel like we've been doing a little bit of talking here. Let's do a little fun segment. I've got some questions lined up with you being a horror super fan,
oh,
self-proclaimed. We're
let's
gonna
see.
we're gonna we're gonna
Don't
put it to the
embarrass me here. I've
we're gonna
been
put it to the
I've been
test.
drinking a little bit, so don't embarrass me.
So these are all going to be opinion questions. It's not going to be like actual
Oh, good,
trivia
good, good.
dates or anything
Okay,
like
great.
that. But coming from a super fan, I want to see like how you view the world of horror and stuff like that. So I want to start with what is your favorite standalone horror film? So not part of a series, a trilogy, nothing like that. It's just one and done.
Wicker Man. It's tattooed on my arm.
And now that leads into what is your favorite horror series?
Ooh, hmm.
And we'll branch into that. We can do old, like classic and more modern.
Yeah, I series is that's a tough one, man. That's a really tough one. Um, oh, I want to say Halloween. I really do. I really do want to say Halloween on that because I have a special affinity for Michael Myers and that whole Samhain kind of thing. So I'm gonna have to say as far as series goes, you know, yeah, I think I'm gonna probably have to stick with that.
So for me, I'm gonna lump trilogies into series here because it all blends together once you get past two. But for the modern ones, for me, I gotta go Terrifier. I love the concept of Art the Clown never saying a word, but
Yep.
just going on these killing sprees because somebody looks at him the wrong way.
Yeah,
That's one of
you saw the short film that was part of All Hallows Eve, right?
yes.
Okay, good, good, good. Okay. Yeah,
That's what got me.
a lot of people never saw that, and I'm like, what the hell is wrong with you? Like,
No, that's what got me into being an art fan, and then we got into Terrifier, and that's
now, I
what
mean,
yeah.
if we're going modern versus old, modern, I would say Insidious
That's also a good one. But then
because
another one for me is House of a
that,
Thousand Corpses, the Firefly trilogy.
so my, you know, I've hung out with Rob Zombie, out in California, when House of a Thousand Corpses was coming out, at the Fangoria convention. My like Rob Zombie stuff, I still think the best thing that he did was Lords of Salem.
That is also a very good film. Yeah.
Like I truly think, like, I think that's where he really, like, he really touched on something with that.
The big thing I liked with the Lords of Salem was he went kind of away from what he usually did, because like House of a Thousand Corpses, that trilogy, 31, all of them had those outlandish characters. And then you get
Exactly.
Lords of Salem where it's toned down. It's actually more of like
Well, right. I mean, but and that's the thing. Like, Lords of Salem touched on so many things. Like, it touched on Rosemary's Baby, and it touched on the Satanic Panic that took place, in the 80s. It touched on a lot of that kind of stuff, but then it also had hints of, like, especially some of the flashes of stuff, like some of Jodorowsky, what was it, the Holy Mountain, you know, just really cool stuff, really cool visuals in that one. That was probably, the my favorite as far as his stuff went.
and now jumping to the next question with we're getting into your favorite killer.
Ooh.
And
Hmm.
this can be series, standalone, just your favorite killer in a horror film.
I mean, see, that's another tough one, man, because there's so much.
I've got a plethora of them on my shirt here.
um, you know, uh, mm, I mean, Jason was an unstoppable killing machine, but towards the end, that, some of those just got ridiculous. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'll watch Friday the 13th, man. I will watch that all the time when it's on. I'll just be like, okay, this is great. Just throw it on. Um, the, like, the slasher stuff like that, you know, oh man, I know it's going to sound terrible. I might have to go Michael Myers again.
I'm along the same lines. I'm a big fan of Leatherface. He's always been one of my
Like,
favorites. Just
Leatherface was good. Texas Chainsaw, the that whole idea of things was really interesting. Um, you know, I really wish that in films they had done more with. I really wish they had done more with Hannibal Lecter.
yeah.
Um, like the intelligent slasher, if you
My
can,
yeah,
if you can call it that.
my thing
Um,
with Leatherface is he was one of the few back in that era that wasn't like a supernatural killer. Like he was
right,
just
right.
someone with a weapon. Like then because you had people like Jason and Freddy who really could not die. They always came back, but Leatherface was calculating and he always was smart about it because he knew he could die. He was just a human with a chainsaw.
Yeah, I mean, you can't argue some of that. But then again, like, I loved Freddy Krueger. I love the idea of, like, you die in your dreams, you die in real life. That was always kind of an interesting kind of caveat in there. Um, you know, I was also a big fan of the Terminator. I
Yeah.
just I like time jumping and, things of that nature. So
Now, next on the flip side of that, we got your least favorite killer. I'm gonna go ahead and say mine first. It's Leprechaun. I just couldn't get
no,
behind.
okay. See, Leprechaun was funny. The first
It
one.
was.
The first one was funny. Warwick Davis, I fucking love Warwick Davis. Like, um, least favorite, and
And like Leprechaun, I love the movies. I just could never get behind being a fan of the Leprechaun itself as a killer. That just
yeah. Um, Least favorite. That's a tough one too, man. You like, and it's gonna sound shitty here. Um, I'm gonna say least favorite is probably Chucky.
I could see the argument for that one too.
Like like first Child's Play, fine. It was interesting. You had that like take on the whole, Twilight Zone talking Tina kind of thing, and that's great. And it was interesting. You know, by the third one, I was like, who gives a fuck?
Yep.
Um, and then Bride of Chucky was interesting, and then again, it just got back to where I was just like, who gives a fuck? So I'm gonna have to stick with that. And I'm sure there's somebody out there that's gonna be, you're out of your goddamn mind, But
Next, we've got your favorite horror monster. This can be anywhere from a xenomorph to Pumpkinhead, but something that's not human-like.
Yeah, the xenomorph. I love the stuff that H.R. Giger did. Those designs and stuff like that. That was really interesting. As a kid, I loved Godzilla. I was like super into Godzilla. But some of the Xenomorph was interesting for sure. The Cloverfield monster, I mean, again, that touches back on like the whole Godzilla thing. That was pretty interesting. But favorite monster, um, I'm gonna say Cthulhu.
It's a good choice. So my first monster flick I remember watching was the Gremlins. So they've always held
There
a
you
big
go.
part. So that they're my favorite monster until I guess at some point somebody will dethrone them. But that they are just because that's the first monster flick that I remember ever watching was that first Gremlins film.
No, I love Gremlins, but I liked Ghoulies better because
I
Ghoulies had like like rituals and like magic worship and like conjuring these entities and stuff like that. And I remember watching Ghoulies and thinking that was like so crazy.
Now we've got I think two more, but before we get into the hardest one, the next one is your favorite subgenre, whether
Um,
it's psychological slashers.
yeah, no, my favorite is folk horror, without a doubt. Um, because there's so much that can be folded into folk horror. um because everybody has a folk tale, you know what I mean? Every
Yeah.
culture has a folk tale, and everything. I mean, anything from, you know you could argue that Candyman is a folk horror tale. It's people living in a city telling this folk tale, and the folk tale comes true.
Yep.
And there's something to be said about that, where it kind of ties in, you know the supernatural, religion, folklore, and modernity, and it just pushes all of those things together. I think there's definitely something cool about the way that those all kind of come together.
So that would be a close second for me. Number one for me has always been slashers, but not all slashers. The ones that are like kind of like Hush or Scream, where it's
Okay.
real, it's like normal people and it's something that could actually happen. Like somebody just gets it in their head that they want to become a serial killer. And
Yeah.
especially like movies like Scream, where the second movie they acted like it was a sequel to the first one. It was because people
Right.
imitating the original killers. That's the kind of stuff that's always been cool for me is the slashers like this if in a way this could actually happen.
Right.
It has for a lot of like you get people like Dahmer and stuff like that where it's like that could very well be
Watch
its own slasher movie.
watch the when was that released? 72, I think it was, the movie Manson, where
Okay.
it's just interviews with all of the remaining Manson family members. And I mean, you watch that and you're like,
Yeah.
that's pretty intense right there. You know,
And then our last one, which I think this is probably the hardest question, is your favorite horror movie kill.
um, hmm. Again, I'm gonna have to go. I'm gonna have to go with Wicker Man. There's something to be said in that last moment where you've experienced this, the songs, all of these things, and you're like, what's going to happen? And he crests that hill, and you realize that they're going to put this guy in this giant wicker effigy, and they're going to burn him to death. And I'm not talking about that Nicolas Cage abortion on celluloid. I'm talking about the original Wicker Man. Um, there is something to be said about that, where you watch that and like it just, I mean, to this day, every May Day I watch The Wicker Man. I've probably seen that movie thousands of times, literally thousands of times. And there's always something about that sequence, the music, the pacing, the way that it's shot, and it just, there's something about it that just gets to me.
I think that's a great pick. And before I say mine, I remember I'd asked Big Nate this before, and his was the Kevin Bacon kill in the first Friday the 13th.
Oh, through the neck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And mine, I don't know if you've seen Bone Tomahawk or not. Have you?
Yes.
With Kurt Russell.
Yep.
It was that kill where they killed his friend right in front of him while he's in the cell. And that's just because out of that whole movie, you knew like the kind of vibe it was gonna give, but that I don't think anybody expected that kill to happen. It just came out of nowhere.
Oh yeah.
And Kurt Russell's
And
acting while he was in the
yeah,
cell while it happened
some
just
of that stuff is like that. I mean, there are some of those, there's plenty of movies out there where you could talk about, those kinds of things, just, crazy kills coming um out of left field. I mean, like, as far as like mainstream kind of stuff goes, it reminds me of the remake of 13 Ghosts, where the door closes and
yeah.
like splits them in half, you know?
Another one for me was
Um,
the first Omen that came out last year. They had the
yep,
guy that played Tywin right at the beginning of the movie. The thing
yep,
just falls and takes off half of his head. I'm like,
yeah,
this is how we're starting this.
yeah. And I mean, but then again, like there are a lot of things, um, there are a lot of like very, very subversive movies out there where some of the the kill sequences, some of the stuff that's in like Lucifer Valentine's movies, like the vomit gore movies, some of those just, they stick with you,
Yeah.
and they just keep going, and that's the thing about some of that, is that, some of those movies, like, depending on how it's done, like I said, with the sound design and everything else, the way that it's shot. I mean, but then again, I think back to movies like Herschel Gordon Lewis's 2000 Maniacs, and
Yep.
some of the kills in there, like the barrel with the nails, and they roll them down the hill, like that was crazy.
Yeah, especially like a movie of that time. Back then you didn't really see that many detailed kills and slashers. A lot of them were
Right. Oh yeah,
off screen,
Herschel
fade to a
Gordon
different
Lewis
scene.
was ahead of his time, man. He was doing, between 2000 Maniacs and The Wizard of Gore, and Color Me Blood Red, and I mean all of that kind of stuff. Like he was your Blood Feast. He was doing some
Yeah.
crazy shit where you're like how is he even getting away with this? Like,
Yeah,
you
'cause
know.
like I said, a lot of times back then they would just go off screen, you'd hear them get killed, or they'd fade to another scene, and you'd be like, "Oh, they're dead." But yeah,
Yeah, but
those
like,
movies.
and then I mean, like, then you have stuff like Wes Craven's Last House on the Left, where some of the kill sequences in that, you watch that and you're just like, like you don't want to see it. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
gruesome.
Now I did realize there was one question I left out, and it was your
Oh,
favorite horror actor, and that's another tough one.
that is always a tough one. I love Vincent Price. I really do. Um, I absolutely love Vincent Price. I love Christopher Lee. Those are two guys that just, like blew me away. I mean, Vincent Price, some of the stuff that he did was just phenomenal. Phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. Um, you get into more modern times, like, I thought Tony Todd was a hell of an actor. Hell of an actor. Um, you know, but I mean, if I had to go with one, yeah, it would be a hard toss up between Vincent Price and Christopher Lee.
I agree with those two, and I was also going to throw Peter Cushing in as like a
Yeah,
third
Peter. I
mention.
mean,
They,
that you're talking like the trifecta right there,
yeah,
man. I mean, like there's something about the three of them that you could legitimately put any combination of those three in a movie, and I would happily sit down and watch it.
I'm the same. That's what I've loved about doing this. This challenge I put for myself is I'm been going chronologically, and then I'll just take a break and watch some more modern films. But back in like the mid to late '60s, early '70s, you had these actors releasing three, four, five movies a year. So
Oh yeah,
you were constantly getting some like phenomenal movies by those
yeah,
three, and they all worked together. Like you'd have some with
yeah,
Vincent and Christopher, some with the other different combinations, and
right.
it was always a
And
damn good movie.
but see, that's the thing. Like the '60s and the '70s, you had a lot of interesting stuff happening there. And I think you and I talked about this, when we were texting back and forth, because you had films that were coming out of Italy at that point. You had films that were coming out of Europe at that point, and films that were coming out of England, and like there was so many like weird things going on in that time period, where you know you had everything from The Wicker Man to Tombs of the Blind Dead to Suspiria to Zombie to, you know what I mean, like just vastly different approaches to these movies. um and all of them had something to them that just drew you in.
Yeah, I was just looking back through our messages. It was the movie Picture Mommy Dead is the one I reached out to you, seeing if you
Yeah,
knew anywhere I could find that to stream, because that was one of the first ones that wasn't on Tubi or YouTube or something like
yeah,
that for me to find it. But yeah, no, the '60s. I mean, I almost out of the '60s, about to go in the '70s, but there were very few movies that were bad, and the ones that were bad were so bad they were good. Now,
yeah. I mean, the '60s is really interesting because you had you had that you had the flower power thing going on starting around like '65, you know, and a lot of that psychedelia kind of stuff started creeping into the films. And then but at the same time, you had Hammer doing, Dracula and Frankenstein, and you know what I mean.
yeah,
So you had classic Gothic type films intermingling with with slasher movies like Peeping Tom, and then
Yeah.
other things that were just coming like way out of left field, like the Dunwich Horror, and there was no real rhyme or reason to it, where you're just watching you're watching these movies. I still remember one movie. I haven't seen it in a million years. What's it called? I think it was called Sometimes Aunt Martha Does Dreadful Things. That I saw it on video, and I was like, what the hell is this? And I think that came out in the 70s. And but there's also a lot of lost movies out there that you know that people are still stumbling on. I mean, The Wicker Man, they only, I mean, within the past, like, I think it was 5 or 6 years, they found a reel of unseen footage. I believe it was in Roger Corman's attic or something like that.
And that's one of the things I've enjoyed. Like, even if like there's those sites that are out there like archive.org and Daily
Nope.
Motion that have a lot of these movies where people upload them that you really can't find anywhere. Like, you'd have to pay a lot of money to get them
Oh yeah.
nowadays. And like, it's
Yeah.
just I have a level of appreciation for those types of websites that try to preserve that history, whether it's
Oh
films,
yeah.
books, stuff like that.
Things like, like um you know they there's some things I would love for them to release. Like, I would love to see a good release of the Owl Service. I would love to see a good release of the Stone Tape. Some of the Nigel Neal stuff, like that kind of stuff. I would love to see good, solid releases. One of my favorite movies was actually a made-for-TV movie starring Melissa Sue Anderson, Midnight Offerings. Would love to see a good release of that. But, who knows if it'll ever happen.
And well, that ended my little questionnaire segment, but I do remember giving you full permission to go down any rabbit holes you wanted to. So I was curious if there's anything that we haven't covered yet that you did want to talk about while we're here tonight. And like I said, feel free to go down any rabbit hole you want. Take as long as you want. Floor is yours
Oh,
now.
I think you and I touched on a lot of stuff, man. I mean, horror is an interesting genre because it can go in so many directions. It can go anywhere. There's a sinister compass inside of it that can lead you, all over the place and all over the world. And people just need to realize that, like, there's horror was always considered like the bastard child. A studio needed to make money, and it was okay. What horror movie can we get on?
Yeah.
And I think that people need to realize that horror as a genre is far more elevated than that. I mean, that's the last thing that I would close on, is that people just need to realize that there's a certain elevation to horror, and it's all good, man. It's all good. Being scared is fun.
Yeah, I agree. And like I said, Josh, I really do appreciate you taking the time to sit with me tonight. And
Please, it's my pleasure, brother.
I honestly could not have thought of a better person to introduce the author and book portion of horror here on Fright Nights than you. And I would definitely love in the future to have you back on, maybe after your next release
Anytime.
or something like that. We'll
Oh,
get
please,
together
man.
and
You let me know, and I will be there for you, brother.
all right, I appreciate it. And for those of you listening in, Josh, let them know where they can find you on social media or anything like that if they want to
Yeah,
check you out.
I'm on Instagram at Josh Haney Horror. I'm on Amazon. All my books are available there. Again, just put in Josh Haney. And The Locket is on there. Sentence Fragments is on there. What the Murder Saw is on there. Psychogeography is on there. And I Also answer summonings on Ouija boards, but only when the stars are right.
And we'll make sure to post a link to the Amazon page with your books down below if anybody's interested in checking them out.
Let's see. If there you go, right there. That's all you need.
All right.
If you can see that QR code, that'll take you right there.
I'm
So
sure at some point Nate can work his magic and clear that up for us, and they'll be able to check it out. But like I said, I really do. I can't thank you enough for joining me here tonight. And
no
it was
problem.
the first episode in studio. We had a snowstorm last month, and I had to record episode 1 in my apartment.
Fun.
Had to tell all my roommates, don't come downstairs. Silence. But yeah, we're at the first one in the studio. I had a lot of fun, Josh, and I'd love to have you back on in the future. I really do appreciate it.
Anytime, man. You take care of yourself, okay?
You too. And for those of you tuned in, you can always check out Fright Nights on the YouTube and the Facebook. We'll have an episode every month. And no, I'm not going to tease next month. You'll have to wait and find out. Tune in for yourself. But that is going to wrap up episode 2 of Fright Nights. Big thanks again to Josh, and I will catch you all on the flip side.
Stay scared, guys.